How's it going? Dave here, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to write really heavy riffs. What is a heavy riff? So a heavy riff is any riff that I think can produce kind of some feeling of rage or anger or intensity, and I think there are many different ways to achieve this. You can achieve this with the production, but you can also achieve this with how you write the riffs and how you treat everything that's around the riff as well. So I've got, I think, 8 tips today. If you follow these tips, your music is going to sound a lot heavier. So, first tip, down-tune your guitar. This is kind of an obvious one, but I thought I'd get it in there. And of course, there are exceptions. Bands like Lamb of God play in drop D, and Dillinger Escape Plan play in standard tuning. But generally, if you want to make a heavier riff, then you're going to want to tune it lower. There's a reason why most bands who are like the heaviest bands tune lower. So what I've done here is I've written a riff and I've played it in drop D, then I play it in drop A straight away, and you can decide for yourself whether it sounds heavier. I think it definitely sounds heavier when I go to drop A. So have a listen. Alright, so the second tip is to target the right notes. As I said, you want to create a feeling of anger and rage, and the major scale or the Lydian scale is not really going to do that. So you want to target these tones that are kind of tense and dark. So things like the minor second, minor third, tritone, and flat 9, they create a really kind of dark and evil kind of sound. So what I've done in this next riff that you're about to hear is I've not followed any particular scale. I've just kind of chosen notes relative to this low A that are kind of dissonant and kind of dark and evil and brooding. So take a listen. So tip number 3 is to use advanced rhythms and syncopation. I find that if you don't know what to expect with a riff and a little chunky open note comes at a time where you're not expecting it, it can just make the riff sound a little bit heavier. So there are different techniques to doing this. You can use polyrhythms, you can use polymeters, and in fact I've done a video on polymeters where I create a Meshuggah style rhythm, and you can check that video up there. This riff that you're about to hear is a cool polymeter. I've written a riff in 19/8. Yeah, it's a very long riff, and I've put 4/4 drums over the top so you can groove to it, but the riff is quite unexpected and you get these low notes that come in weird places where you wouldn't expect them. So have a listen. So tip number 4 is your articulation and how you play your notes. So the guitar is a very expressive instrument. We can do bends, we can do slides, we can do vibrato, and people tend to only kind of use this in a soloing or lead context, but you can really be more expressive with your riffs and make them sound darker. You can give them more energy and life by adding these different techniques in. So things like something I learned from Vildiata is Vildiata are a band that you should check out. They released my favorite album of all time. If you haven't heard of them, go check them out. But they do this cool little thing where if you wanted to play the 7th fret of the A string, for example, you'd slide down from the 8th fret really quickly. It's called a grace note, and you just go. It sounds a little bit better than just going. And then those little bends can just add a little more energy to your riffs, as well as palm muting, of course. It can add a chunkiness to your riffs, and your pick attack is really important. You really want to lay into the strings. As my good friend James says, you can't be tickling the strings and expect the chonk, and I'm going to use that saying from now on forever. Check out this riff. I've written this riff and played it twice. The first time I am not paying any attention to my articulation or to my pick attack, and then the second time I pay attention to it. I hit the strings harder. I'm using a few more techniques like that grace note, slides and bends. It just adds a little bit more heaviness to the riff. It's probably the most subtle difference you'll hear in this video, but it's still heavier than before, so it's definitely worth adding into your playing. Tip number 5 is to use contrast, and what I mean by contrast is contrasting high notes to low notes. You're playing in drop A, for example. That's a pretty low note, that low A, but it will sound even lower, and the difference is so great that it has a bigger effect when you hit that low note. And some high notes you can use is what's called, I think, the panic chord, where you take a semitone interval and just play them both at the same time. I love doing that. So in this riff, I've just played a little kind of chord progression quite high up, and then hit that little tritone chord there, which if you don't know is really useful for like deathcore and breakdowns and stuff. So first fret of the lowest string, then the open next string, and then the first fret of the next string. Creates a really horrible dissonant and chunky sound. So that's what I've done in this riff, so have a listen. Tip number 6 might be a little bit of an obvious one, but it is definitely really effective, and that is to do a tempo change, and not to go faster, but to go slower. And if you play a riff and then you play the riff again slower, then it's just going to feel a bit heavier. One really hilarious example of this is Extreme by We Butter the Bread with Butter. If you've not heard the breakdown in that, just go and check it out. Like, they keep slowing it down for like 2.5 minutes until it gets to like literally about like 0 beats per minute. I'm not even exaggerating. It's like hilarious. It just sounds like wind at one point. Definitely check that out. So in this riff that I've written, that you're about to hear, it's just a bit of a chunky palm muted riff. Something like that. We go through 2 tempo changes, and each one makes the riff sound a little bit heavier. So have a listen. So these last 2 tips that I've got for you are things that are not the actual riff. These are things around the riff that you can change to make the riff itself sound heavier. The first one is to create atmosphere with kind of atmospheric synths or atmospheric reverby guitar lines. Like I said in tip number 2, you want to target those kind of dark and haunting kind of sounds, like the flat second, flat ninth, tritone, flat third, that kind of thing. So what I've done in this riff is I've just played a breakdown on the open power chord, and then there's no atmosphere. Second time round, I add atmosphere. I add like a little kind of pad synth, and then I'm doing some little tritones, tremolo picked on the guitar over the top, and it just makes the riff sound a little bit heavier. Now, the final tip is to change the drums. The drums are really important when it comes to making something sound heavy. I've told many people, many of my students, that you could play the exact same thing on guitar and change the drums and it becomes a completely new genre. So the drums are super important. So some tips for making your riff sound heavier with the drums is to line up the riff with the kick drum, or the other way around, line the kick drum up with the riff. So you have a riff and make sure the kick drum's doing the exact same rhythm. Also, you can change to a different cymbal. So as you'll hear in the example, I start on a hi-hat and I move to a China cymbal, and the China cymbal just kind of sound very aggressive. And also another thing you can do is half time the drums. So instead of going you can kind of go and it can really improve how heavy the riff sounds. So what I've done in this riff is I've written the most boring riff imaginable, something that doesn't sound very heavy at all, just so that you can put focus on the drums and you can hear how much the riff improves by just changing the drums around it. So have a listen. So those were my 8 tips for writing heavier riffs. If you enjoyed it, please click like. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Do you have any other tips for writing heavy riffs? Did I miss anything out that might have been obvious? Let me know in the comments too. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Hit that notification bell so that every time I release a new video, you're notified. If you're new to the channel, I do a lot of videos like this. My channel is based around getting the most out of your guitar, becoming as creative as possible on the guitar. If you're interested as well in creating really interesting chord progressions, then I've got the first 2 chapters of my book, Chord Charisma, available for free. And you can go and check that out in the description. What it does, it shows you how to create a really cool diatonic chord progression. And then from there, I show you different shapes for 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords. So extensions you can add onto those chords to make them sound even better. And that's all for free. So definitely go and check that out. You've got nothing to lose. And I will see you in the next video.